So I am Judy Chu, and I study boys' relationships and boys' socialization, their gender socialization, and their development. I teach a course on boys' psychosocial development at Stanford University, which I've taught there since 2003. I'm also chair of the Movember Foundation Global Men's Health Advisory Committee, which tries to help boys and men live happier, healthier, longer lives. And I'm also co-chair of the board of directors for Promundo US, which works to engage boys and men in promoting gender equity.
Did you have the idea for your book before you did your research, or did you do your research before you did your book?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with how I came to study boys, because it's not always obvious to people how I did that. And I definitely studied boys before I never thought I would write a book. And so it was definitely not like, oh, I'm going to write a book, then I'll go study boys. It was, I came to study boys because boys asked me to study them. It was actually the year after my first year at Harvard as a doctoral student. I was home chauffeuring my 13-year-old brother and his friends during the summer. And one of his friends said, oh, so what are you learning tell us what you're learning at Harvard. And so I said, okay.
Like, why are you putting that down? It should be, tell us what you're learning at Harvard.
They're just like, but 13-year-olds are like, oh, go ahead and try to impress us, right? Yeah. But no, so I said, well, actually, one of the things I found really exciting was I met this woman named Carol Gilligan. Oh. And I had, not known her work before I got there. I'd heard of her, but not really read her work or learned. And so I took these classes with her. And she does this work with adolescent girls. And she really kind of changed the conversation about, our understanding about not just adolescent girls, but about human development by really listening to girls and kind of finding out what their experiences were and what their perspectives were, and really shedding light on the centrality of relationships, like how important relationships are. And also how girls, especially during adolescence, come up against these kind of expectations about how to be a perfect girl or nice girl or how to be desirable, and and the toll that can take on girls, right? And so this boy who asked me what I was learning said, that's all fine and good, and I get it. That's definitely important, and we're supportive of that. But you know what? There's stuff going on for us boys too, and nobody's talking to boys. So he says, you know what? You should study boys. You can start with me. And so I was kind of like taken aback, didn't know quite what to do with that. Went back to Harvard that fall and was taking a clinical interviewing class with Carol Gilligan, and told her what this boy had told me. And she goes, you should go study him. Clearly he has something he wants to say. And so for my projects for that class, I did interviews with him, when I went home for winter break and things like that. And he talked for like 2 hours. I never thought an adolescent boy would want to talk to me for more than, a few minutes or in the car on the way somewhere. But he talked for 2 hours, talked about his friendships, talked about, his, romantic interests, talked about, all the things that he was coming up against as a 13-year-old.
Like his gender pressure or his just emotional experience, or both?
Well, just kind of what was going on with his life, like what it was like to be a boy. And so, I mean, it didn't really start out with like, I'm going to go in and study gender in particular. I was just wondering, what are the messages that boys are hearing, and how does that sit with them? Like, does it make sense? And they're like, yeah, totally. This is where I want to go. Or are they struggling with it? And stuff, because, in patriarchy, the way we construct gender, it's obviously harmful to girls, right? Because yes. Because status and power, girls have less of it.
You're
right?
Like, that's so it's very clear.
Exactly. And so the assumption is like, oh, well, then it must be good for boys, right? They must be, they have the status, they have the power, they must be, coasting. And so I was wondering, is that the case, or is it not the case? Like, how are they experiencing this? And so it was, it was a genuine
interrupt for a second. I feel like I'm in class with you. I love it. I'm learning so much.
No worries.
Did it feel like you had a preconceived notion of it? Like when you said the thing about like, would they be coasting? Did you have a sense that they would be and you were surprised, or did you really have no idea or preconceived notion of what it would be?
Oh, that's a great question. You know what? I think I had just I was always just mostly interested in like, what do the boys think? What's going on with them? And I knew from my brother that there were, boys like everyone, they have problems, they have struggles. But I wasn't really thinking like specifically like, how is masculinity problematic for them. It was really just wondering, is it problematic for them?
So
and
if so, open. Right. Okay.
Yeah, so I was really coming at it. I mean, obviously I came in with certain things that were affected by the stereotypes that we hear, like just even the assumption that, oh, boys aren't going to want to talk to me and boys aren't going to be, interested in whatever, but they were. And so I was constantly like pleasantly surprised. And I think that's kind of one of the overarching findings was that, of course we have all these things in common. I mean, they're human too. They have struggles too. And it's just like ridiculous to think that I wouldn't have thought that, of course they do, And so I always say, like, anyone who knows a boy knows that they have these struggles, but we also know that they can be capable of telling us things about their inner lives, about their emotions. They can be sensitive and attuned to other people, that they have the full range of human capabilities that anyone has, but for some reason we underestimate it or we overlook it, and we just always say, oh, well, they're not interested in that. And that's so informed by again, those popular stereotypes that we have about boys. And it and seeing how unfair that is. Like, if we think about it, like even in terms of like physicality, like when a boy falls down and like breaks his arm, we're like, oh, walk it off. And then why would we think that was something you could walk off, right? It's like they're human, and so we have physical pain and they're gonna cry. And so or even like emotional pain, like a best friend tells them, I don't want to be your best friend anymore. Of course that's going to hurt, but they're supposed to be like, I didn't need him anyway, I'll go get another best friend. And again, just kind of having this robotic expectation, like somehow they should not feel the things that everyone feels is just kind of, and so kind of in listening to them talk about the things that were expected of them, really feeling like, gosh, that really sucks. It really sucks that you can't show those things, because how do you not? Because I'm also someone who I feel everything so intensely. And to think about like, oh, if I couldn't let people know I was feeling those things, how hard that would be how much energy that would take. And so it kind of forces or compels them towards this disconnection, because if we have to compartmentalize these things, because, oh, what can I show to whom, where, and when, again, that takes up a lot of mental energy, a lot of emotional energy, and those disconnections then disrupt their ability to how they're present in the world, right? How they're present in their relationships, and how they move through, and always having to be cautious. And so they, the boys would tell me these things about like having to keep up their guard, and it wasn't because they were paranoid by nature. It was because they were experiencing very real pressures, very real repercussions when they revealed their vulnerability. And so kind of seeing like, oh, actually the way that boys conduct themselves, which sometimes coincide with those stereotypes, like them seeming like they're indifferent, seeming like they don't care, that's really, a response to what the way that they're, it's a savvy and strategic response to the peer group culture that they're seeing, to the expectations that sometimes adults or media are, having of them. Like, oh, you're supposed to be stoic, you're supposed to be tough. And so it really creates like this, as Freud says, man created for himself a civilization in which he's destined to live in discomfort, right?
How uncomfortable can we be?
Exactly.
Apparently very uncomfortable.
Right. And so, and then the things, I'm sure you heard from Niobe Way, things like that are just off limits. Like if anything that gets deemed feminine, boys aren't supposed to do it, because otherwise, it's a weakness, it's a liability if you're a boy and you show that you care about people, or that you have all these vulnerable feelings like sadness and pain and anger, or even joy. I mean, if you see a boy really exuberant with joy, people are like, what's wrong with you? You need to, chill out, you need to calm down. And so they're not allowed to feel things intensely, which again, kind of, they can learn to do it, bring things under control, so to speak. And again, control is another one of those things we kind of push boys and men towards, but to what detriment, right? At what cost? To themselves, in terms of their sense of integrity, and also to their ability to connect with other people, which is such a central motivation and driving force in their lives. Like they just want to belong and feel accepted and feel that someone knows them. And that kind of need to constrain their self-realization as well as their self-expression totally gets in the way of that. So I started out studying adolescent boys because I was led to study boys by these adolescent boys. And I went into, an independent private school, boys' school out in Massachusetts. And it was 12 years old to 18 years old. And I interviewed about 60 of them. And they told me things, what they're coming. Basically, I started my interviews with, do you ever feel like as a boy, there's certain expectations, ways that people expect you to be? And if so, how? And if not, how do you do that? Because sometimes other people say that they do feel that. So how do you not feel that pull and things like that? And what they were telling me, or the patterns in their narratives, was saying that, part of growing up is that you just have to accept that there's always going to be this gap between the way boys are said to be, like how people view you because you're one of the boys, versus how you experienced yourself to be as an individual. So basically, in other words, no one will ever know who you really are, right? And you just need to, and the more you
It's so sad,
isn't it? And if you mourn it, then you're weak and you haven't succeeded in growing up. And so they really tied it in with an issue of maturity and just proving themselves, as boys and as adults, as men and adults. And so this idea that you just have to accept it, and that's just the way that life is. And so Carol, she had this hypothesis that the kind of heightened pressures for girls to conform to feminine stereotypes or feminine expectations happens for boys at an earlier age. She suspected that it was happening at early childhood. And that had to do with two things. One of them was that there was evidence of kind of emotional turmoil, like things like depression, or, at the time it was like kind of ADHD prescriptions, or even just kind of social pressures. Like, we're okay with a girl being a tomboy until she starts to develop secondary sex characteristics. Then she looks like a young woman, so she needs to act like a young woman, right? But with boys, like the whole sissy, mama's boy, or the, more horrible things that they call little boys, those come in earlier, right? Those come in around age 4, 5, 6. So she used to kind of say, patriarchy goes after boys first because they're more important to maintaining the patriarchy. This is not to say that girls have.
God, I never thought of it that way, but right, like we're going to get you to be prepared to continue the control. Wow. Okay.
So this is not to say that girls don't hear any messages. I mean, they don't get a free pass through it, but it's less intensive. It's less consequential. Like, again, like we're totally fine. In fact, in these days, we almost celebrate girls who are tomboys. We're like, great, she can do sports. She can do what, be interested in whatever. At least we say that. There's another issue there too. But with little boys, we worry that they're not going to make it if they don't toughen up early. I was a little bit reluctant because I was intimidated by the younger age group. I was like, oh, well, I just finished adolescence. I was like 24 at the time. I'm like, I'm finishing my adolescence. I feel more comfortable talking to adolescent boys. I feel like I know how to talk to them. But younger kids, I was intimidated partly because I also think I'm really impressed and I really respect little kids because they're so attuned. They're so still connected to everything they're feeling. They're so genuine. And I was like, they will read me in an instant. They will know how nervous I am. And they'll be like, oh no, we can't be bothered with you or something like that. And so she actually drove me there, and she's like, I'm going to take it. She really believed, this was worth looking at. And I was like, okay, we'll go look, but I'm not sure what will happen. I don't even know how to talk to 4-year-olds. I don't know what they'll be able to tell me. So it was a very novice, definitely what Carol calls like starting from a premise of not knowing. And for me, not even knowing what I was doing, but just knowing that I really cared about this, learning about this. I really wanted to learn from them. And luckily, because they're so attuned, they picked up on that and really took me under their wing. I mean, both age groups.
Oh, that's the sweetest. They were like, she really is into us. She respects us. Let's do this with her. That's so cute.
So it was a lot about, establishing that relationship with both age groups. I mean, like with the younger ones, just needing to know that I wasn't going to tell on them, that I wasn't one of the other adults that was there to spy on them and to kind of critique them, that I just wanted to know what was going on. Because in that particular classroom, there were already some gendered expectations. Like, one of the teachers would say to me, oh, because she thought she was being helpful, but she'd be like, look how the girls come in so nicely, but look at the boys, they're like a pack of wild animals. And I'm like, that's not a good, that doesn't set a good scene,
like,
for appreciating what they can do. But they knew that I liked them. And I always say that, boys can tell you what they need and, what's going on for them if they trust that you're really interested. And so I didn't know that when I started the study. I was nervous that they would not want to tell me anything, but I found that, again, they noticed that and they took care of me, and they took care of me. And some of them would say, oh, well, if you want to know what it's like to be a boy, here's what you need to know. And then they would show me. And I was so grateful and so appreciative. I feel like I was just so lucky to be able to learn these things from them, because they were so, and then they felt it was really important too. They're like, yeah, this will be helpful. This will make things better if you know this, and somebody needs to listen to this. And so even the 4-year-olds.
What was the major thing? This will be helpful for you to know it and it'll make things better. What would you say that, like, let's say 2 major things?
I think from what I'm thinking of right now that first comes to mind, and this isn't necessarily what I prioritized in my book, but one of the things that comes to mind is this one boy was just feeling like, look at how we treat each other. And it's not because like he was trying to blame, like trying to get one of his peers in trouble, but kind of, it was almost like, look at how it's set up that we end up treating each other like this. And it shouldn't have to be this way. And so really feeling like one of the boys' mothers, because Carol and I also met with the boys' mothers and the fathers separately. And, when the boys' mother said, made the comment that, what looks to adults like play is actually work, because they're constantly figuring out, how can I fit in? How can I connect? And that's, again, this primary driver for them is they just want to be with each other, right? But there are these rules, and these rules come down partly from adults, partly from society in an abstract sense, but also partly from each other, because they hear, they see things, they watch things, and then they inflict these things on each other, and they know it's not fair, they know it's not nice, they don't like it, but they don't know how to get out of it. So it's kind of like, can you help me if I tell you what my
alternative here? Is there an alternative situation that I could go into?
Exactly. And also kind of really that question of, is there a place for me here? Like, is there a way that I can be myself and be in the world and it'll be okay? And I think we all want to know that, right? We're constantly asking ourselves that throughout our lives. Like, we see the world, we sometimes see good things, hopefully, and sometimes we see things that are not so good. And we're always asking ourselves, how, to what extent can I be myself and also be with other people? Is there a place for me? And especially in ways, like I said, at that age, most of them are very sensitive, they're very in touch, and they're also learning that maybe that's not okay with everyone, and what to do with that, and where they can go. And so,
how can they advocate for themselves? And if they do, what repercussions would they face?
Right. And so this one boy, the one that was like, this will be very helpful, it was so sweet, but it was also very sad, because he's like, I said, have you talked to anybody else about this? And he said he actually did tell his mom, but she kind of brushed it off and said, oh, I think you're just joshing, like, I think you're kidding. I don't think it's as bad as you think it is. And so what he learned from that was, he can't tell her these things, because and actually he said solemnly, she didn't believe me. Oh. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry, because it was the second year that I was with these kids. And so some new kids had come in, and he was a new kid. And so they had this kind of boys club, the mean team, and they had established it. And what they did was, where it had been kind of bifurcated by gender previously, like they changed it the second year to the kids who were there before to the kids versus the kids who were new. And so it became not a gender specific team that second year. And he was on the outside because he was a new kid. So he was feeling like they were constantly trying to blocking every effort he was making to be included and to play with them. And he was trying to tell his mom that this was what was happening. And she was like, don't worry about it. It's fine. But it clearly wasn't.
It was not fine. It's not fine.
There isn't enough focus in most programs on here's what's wonderful that boys in
or kids
of all gender can
hold
do.
On to that, right?
And how do you foster those things, their relational strengths, as I'll refer to, or like, how do you foster their connections? Because they know how to do this. They're born, the infant studies show they are born with these, the fundamental capacity and a primary desire for connection. Yeah. And then, so what happens? What happens along the way? Like, what goes wrong? And how can we, kind of bolster the sources from which they're drawing strength so that they can resist those pressures that pull them away from who they are and what they're able to do. Yes. And I think that, definitely parents are very interested, but we've also as parents grown up with these scripts and these stereotypes. And so it's hard to envision the alternative, but it's definitely there. Like, I'm sure that you're familiar with the whole, Paul Kivel's Be a Man exercise, or and the implied be a man is be a real man. Like, what does that mean? And how oftentimes, these days we talk of toxic masculinity and all the harmfulness, how that's a bad thing, and how to prevent our boys. But if you ask the same boys, now, what does it mean to be a good man? They know that too, right? And they know that too because they've seen that as well. And so it's really about like kind of replacing the default, you know what I mean, in their minds, but also in their options, and saying like, here are some things that, and really highlighting, because also when we do the preventative thing, then it puts boys and men on the defensive. Like, you think I'm destined to become this horrible thing.
Yes.
And changing that narrative to being like, no, I see that you have these strengths. I know that you're capable of knowing and doing these things, and it will serve you well in life to develop those things. Shutting those things down, I know it may feel like the adapted thing to do in the, in this immediate situation, but in the long term, as a leader, as a partner, as a friend, as anybody who's going to have relationships with other people, having these skills is important to your health and happiness and to the health and happiness of people you care about. We have kind of created a script of development, a trajectory that we put boys and men on, and also girls to some extent, and all genders, to say, that says individuation, that associates individuation and separation, moving out of relationships with strength, with, with maturity, and with, for boys, as a hallmark of their masculinity. Like, if you need people, somehow that demasculates you.
That's
right.
Bad.
And
why?
so,
how? Why? When did that happen?
Exactly. And especially when there are just so much research that shows that we need people. The relationships are so essential, not only to our mental health, but to our physical health. And so, I also, in a kind of cheeky summary, I always say patriarchy sucks for everyone. I mean, obviously it's bad for some groups more than others, but it really is not looking out for any individual. The whole zero-sum framing of the discourse, like who's worse off, and you can only look at one or the other. It doesn't make any sense, because that actually just prevents us from questioning the bigger problem, which is how we've structured, how patriarchy structures things. And I know that a lot of people are kind of averse to talking about patriarchy, but it's a very simple descriptor. It's a hierarchy, and it's a hierarchy that includes gender, but it also includes race, and it's, men over women and some men over other men, right? And so it's this idea, and also what comes with that is the implication that there is only one right or best way to be. And that has implications for everyone, right? Because if you are not that thing, and actually Joe Pleck, who wrote The Myth of Masculinity in 1981, showed that ultimately is like an unattainable ideal anyway. I guess by definition, ideals are unattainable. But so it sets boys and men up to strive towards an image of masculinity that in relation to which they will ultimately fall short, right? Yes. So then you think about what that creates for the individual. They're like, I need to be this. I know in my heart of hearts that even if I can appear that way to others, I actually don't measure up. And that what that does to their self-esteem, what that does to the way that they conduct themselves, because they always, they move through the world not wanting to be found out or revealed to be human, vulnerable, weak in all the ways that humans are naturally. And so it really, again, creates, a situation for themselves in which they're destined to live in discomfort because they can't reveal. And all for what? For this promise of something that doesn't really deliver. Like, even if you succeed by all of society's prescribed standards, at the end of the day, a lot of these successful people are unhappy because they're disconnected. They struggle to connect with other people because that's the cost of getting there. When we're parents, we don't know what we're trying to do our best. We don't know. Like, every night I go to bed and I'm like, oh my gosh, I did this wrong. I did that wrong. I shouldn't have said this. I shouldn't have said that. There's just this, it's so easy to feel just horrible, all the time. Doing. And so I think a lot of it just gives me a sense of like, first of all, there's room for error. Yeah. The infant studies of Ed Tronick's work, he has a new book out called The Power of Discord. In a nutshell, it's like parents are led to believe that we have to keep everything good all the time, so that we can have happy, healthy children. But it's actually, that's unrealistic. And then it makes us feel guilty for things that are unrealistic to uphold anyway. And he says there's inevitable mismatches. There's going to be miscommunications. You're going to read somebody wrong, whatever. And it's the opportunity to repair those mismatches that becomes so crucial to a healthy relationship. And it teaches, right? And it teaches us and our kids that, this happens, but we're resilient. Relationships are resilient. We get second chances. And so you don't go through life feeling really anxious, like, oh no, now it's all or nothing. It shows you that, no, it's a process and you work through it. And, and you show you care by being there to kind of say, hey, I think we misunderstood something. Here's what I meant, here's what you said, and working it through. And that's actually the key to a healthy relationship or positive development, as opposed to everything through rose-colored glasses. Everything is happy all the time.
Because it sets you up for failure, because then you get older and you're like, fuck, like,
right.
There's no do-over here, whatever it is.
Whenever I did, especially the adolescent boys, at the end of the interview, I'd say, do you have any questions for me? And after they kind of revealed all these vulnerabilities and all these concerns and worries, they'd be like, am I the only one who feels this way? Is there a problem with me? And I loved being able to tell them, every single person I've talked to, regardless of gender, feels like this. And so it is not just you. There was a film called The Mask You Live In. I don't know if
I've seen that.
One of the things I love about that film is in 90 minutes, everyone can see it's not just them. And that sense of being joined and in it together, that this is hard, that socialization is not natural and was never supposed to be easy, and that there's a huge loss that you should actually feel a sadness about that loss, and normalizing that. I feel like kids need to hear, and adults need to hear that message, because I know a lot of adults too who constantly feel like they're being measured against this impossible standard, but they're not allowed to name that it's actually impossible. So then it becomes their shame. Yes. And then instead of saying like, actually, there's a huge problem with the system, we're much more willing these days in recent years to say, there's a problem with the system, there's a problem with what's being asked of us. And you're not wrong to complain about it, because it actually is horrible. And we have research that shows it leads to all sorts of bad things. And so I think in terms of parenting, like, it definitely didn't mean that, oh, now I do everything perfectly. It's so far from it. I mean, now I still make all the mistakes, but I feel like that's okay, right. And that there's going to be a second chance. And then also, I know some of your other guests said this too, but just modeling for your kids that life is messy. Life is hard. So, so we don't have time to be policing other people about what their behaviors are, but instead just kind of forgiving ourselves for being messy and, imperfect, and then connecting with others around our imperfections and our common goal to do the right thing. Boys have these relational capabilities, which are human strengths, not feminine weaknesses. But then also there's a shift that I observed, during early childhood, where they learn to cover those things up, not to show them. And it turns out that those are actually the things that are most appealing about them. But, socialization and societal messages tell them, you can't show these things. These will make you girly or whatever and weak. Wendy, she wrote The Blessings of a Skinned Knee, and The Blessings of a B+, but there's this one line that she wrote that said, our children are not our masterpieces. And that comes up for me a lot. I use that as a gentle reminder, like when I'm busy trying, with all best intentions, trying to cultivate the right path in my son, just remembering that in the end, he's, the best thing I can do is just kind of let him do, and that's hard because I'm a control freak. You're like
full disclosure.
Exactly. I'm like, oh no, it's really hard for me to not say stuff. And most of the time I fail, I say stuff anyway. But then I try to explain myself to him and he's like, you worry too much. but it's a good reminder, like they're not our masterpiece. Because I think a lot of parents, again, with the best intentions, with so much love, with wanting good things for our kids, we are too hands-on. And we want to make things right for them. But part of it is the struggle does make them stronger. It does make their choices feel like their choices. And it also, again, builds that resilience and grit, or all the terms we hear flying around these days. It's through kind of having to work through it. And it's hard for us to watch our kids struggle or to go through difficult times, but that does actually make them stronger and able to endure. But in terms of like parenting, and I always say this, and it applies to boys and to anyone really, is I always say, start with listening. And I'd say that to parents, researchers, educators, anyone, because again, kids can tell you what they need. So instead of and this also even goes in with interventions that we do on a policy level. Like you can't just come in and say, I know what's best for you. And I'm gonna tell you how to do it. You really,
you're like, even work. If I know what's best for you.
Exactly. I always say no useful conversation ever started with, what the problem with you is, or that the problem that you're headed toward is. They're going to turn you off right away. That's because you have kids, right? And so it's really like, let me understand, where you are, where you're coming from. So listening, and then I always go back to also Mr. Rogers. I feel like he really got it right.
I love Mr. Rogers. He's on the homepage of our website. Yeah,
I think he's such a hero. And I think again, because he was kind, and compassionate. People often discount him. And I think that's a huge mistake, because he really got it right. What everyone needs to hear is, I like you just the way you are. Our healthy preference is always going to be for wholeness, right? And authenticity. And we can't do that everywhere with everyone, but we at least need to know for ourselves what's true. And there's a huge danger. We become able to do harm to ourselves and others when we disconnect from ourselves. And then the other thing, of course, is what we've been talking about, is that connection to others, right? And that's like that sense of belonging, feeling like someone sees you, someone knows you, they accept you, and they're there for you, and you could reach out if you needed to, and that there's a sense of like belonging to the community or something bigger than yourself, and that how important those things are. So really fostering those things. And, it's not to say that your kids are never going to do problematic things, but if we can preserve their integrity and they preserve their relationships, that gives them a huge advantage. I mean, the Ad Health study in where they, it's an enormous study that was in Minnesota. They like surveyed 90,000 adolescents. They interviewed like 40,000. So it's just enormous.
Wow.
And they found it's Resnick et al. You can look it up. It's called the Adolescent Health Study, and it's still going on. It's longitudinal, but they found that the single best protector against psychological risk, like depression, low self-esteem, and then social risk, like unintended pregnancy, dropping out of school, those kinds of things, was having access to at least one close confiding relationship. So at least knowing at least one person that you could talk to if you needed to, that you felt like knew you and accepted you the way Mr. Rogers does, you know what I mean? And that sense was the single best protector against all these kinds of things that they're going to come up against. And I think one misconception is that people think like, oh, healthy means you have no problems. And that's not true. Healthy means you have the same problems, but you also know you're going to make, you have a sense that you can work through them. You have a sense that you can get help. And when we aren't given that sense, or when we're denied that, as boys often are, like, oh, you can't ask for help. And, if you can't, if you're, because of the whole all or nothing, like, oh, you fell short in this way, so forget you, you're off, you're out of the running. You take away all the things that are supposed to help protect them, how to help protect them against life's inevitable obstacles, right? And so, or they think, oh, no, I'm struggling, so therefore I fail. It's like, no, struggling's supposed to happen, but it's that how you deal with it and how you're told you can deal with it. And so I think what parents can do is say, again, just being there, admitting that they're imperfect, the parents, and allowing their kids to be imperfect, and but believing that that there's something good in them that they can help to manifest and develop. I think is really important. My husband always warns me about like saying like things like, oh, you can be whoever you want, because you're just like, well, you don't want them to be like Nazis, you don't want them to be like really violent. You can't say like anything you are,
anything but a Nazi.
Exactly. But I'm like, but I guess it's like, again, kind of this faith, Mr. Rogers kind of faith that actually, I don't think most people are born wanting to hurt people. I think that happens when we become fractured. And then, like I said, it's when we disconnect from our sense of kind of that just wanting to be good, wanting to do the right thing. People were not meant to want to harm other people, not meant to want to discount other people. It's only when we feel threatened and when we feel disconnected that we become capable of doing horrific things.